Welcome to the show. This is the Magician and the Fool podcast. My name is Dominic. I'm one of the co-hosts of the show. The other co-host is named Janus, and he will be showing up soon. This is episode number 64. Today we speak to Mr. Ike Baker. Ike is an author, a content creator, a practicing ceremonialist, and initiate of several lineages within the Western esoteric tradition, including Freemasonry, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and the Martinist Order of America. And he also hosts the Arcanvm YouTube channel and podcast, where he produces presentation-style videos on the occult and esoteric, and converses with some of the foremost practitioners, scholars, and authors in the fields of magic, esotericism, and the occult. Very similar to what we do. We would definitely recommend you check out his YouTube channel and podcast, and you can also check in with him at his website, ikebaker.com. Ike is an extremely knowledgeable, charismatic, and articulate proponent of Western esotericism, and is just a fascinating guy to listen to and hang out with. It was a lot of fun. We are sure you're going to enjoy this. Before we jump into the episode, we would like to say a huge thank you to our Patreon supporters. The reality is the show does cost money to produce, as well as time, of course, and we really do count on our supporters to help keep things running. If the funds dry up, then it's likely that the show will eventually come to an end, which is inevitable someday anyway. But if you would like to help us continue producing this kind of content, please feel free to go to our Patreon page and do what you can to help us out with a one-time donation or a continuing donation. We dedicate this to Hermes and Asclepius. May any merit that we generate doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings, so that they, together with us, may equally realize awakening. Welcome to the show. We are excited to have Mr. Ike Baker with us. He is an initiate of Freemasonry, the Golden Dawn. He's a podcaster, scholar, I would say, and, all around cool guy. We're happy to have him here. We've got a lot to talk about. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been a fan for a number of years, so it's a real pleasure to be here with you guys.
Well, we're so pleased to have you. You're doing great work.
Thank you.
Yes, very great work. And we're going to definitely talk about your offerings, your podcast, your YouTube channel. You're working on some manuscripts, lots of stuff going on. But for those of you, the audience who don't know you, we like to always start, at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this stuff, and we'll just go from there, because there's a lot of topics we can touch on.
Sure. So it's a pretty strange story, actually. I had studied comparative religions, things like Hebrew mysticism as well. I had some early training when I was about 19 years old in Zazen, Buddhism, meditation, the koans and all that stuff. And even pursued esoteric Taoist energy work, but kind of a grab bag. In the spirit of my times, really my generation, it was spirituality a la buffet, and probably around 2006, 2007. My aunt had a tenant, and this tenant threw herself in front of a train. Turns out my aunt had to go and clear the apartment out. And she asked me and one of my friends at the time if we'd help her, because apparently this lady was a hoarder. So there was a ton of stuff. And so we went over there, and she had a section of the apartment which was just filled with piles of books and like notebooks and stuff. I mean, when you open them, the binding, the spine crackled because they'd never been touched. There was still cellophane on the journals. So I saw this one book. Actually, it's still right here. It's still right on my bookshelf. It was called The Oracle of Kabbalah by Richard Seidman. And I just looked at the cover, and it had this really interesting kind of like Semitic, Perso-Arabic almost, kind of design to it. And I grabbed it and I said, this is going to be weird, but can I take this? And she said, yeah, the less I have to like, either throw in the trash or donate, the better. So, I read this book in one day, walking around my neighborhood, and I closed it. Still was not really, I didn't have any greater depth of understanding of the Kabbalah from this particular book than I had from my previous very topical, superficial studies. But I kind of knew this was important. And so back when the internet had like yellow pages and white pages, I typed in Long Island Kabbalah, because that's originally where I'm from. And there was this study group, and had this guy's name. It had his phone number and an email. So I reached out and I said, hey, I'd love to be a part of this Kabbalah study group. And the message I got back was, we're not doing that anymore, but there's this other thing. And that other thing turned out to be the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And the rest kind of unfolded from there. So I fairly haplessly wandered into the Western esoteric tradition. It's been a number of years, almost a decade since my first initiation. I put off initiation for a while because I truly did not understand what people who claimed to be doing magic thought that they were doing. So, but like many other things, I ended up, I feel like, where I needed to be, no matter, like, despite myself. So I underwent a very serious course of training with this particular temple that I became a part of. And it was really, really great. And I feel like I had such an amazing advantage because of how little I knew about Western occultism at the time. I wasn't constantly attempting to project my expectations on the processes of the outer order of the Golden Dawn, which I see a lot of people, as a temple chief now, I see a lot of people try and do that. Not intentionally. It's a consequence of just this overabundance of information constantly. So, and since then I've gotten involved in a number of other organizations that are of really high caliber people, high quality initiates. And so I am somebody who's constantly learning. And my goal in all this is to just take what I can to the public dialogue, where I guess the most action is happening, what forums, and offering the perspective of somebody who seriously, I attempt as much as I can to rigorously research these various fields of study that comprise the Western esoteric traditions, but also to explain them in the light of insight that perhaps, only a practitioner can really have. It's because there's so much that happens at an interior level that is just not really discussed a lot of times. So that's what I'm hoping to do with the Arcanvm channel and podcast, and with all the manuscripts and things like that. And, again, I appreciate you guys for giving me the opportunity to sort of further amplify what I'm trying to accomplish here.
Absolutely. And the thing is, in this tradition, that so many of us have so much of a passion for. The way we move forward is by this incremental, personal, gradual effort. It's kind of like in the independent sacramental tradition, which you're also involved in. We priests in the apostolic sacramental tradition that's independent, that's outside of the Romanists and the official orthodoxy, we don't tithe. We don't have large communities paying for our vestments, for our churches, for our bills. We have jobs, we have families, we have homes, we have bills, we have expenses, and still out of our pockets we're paying for our chalices, And the reason I'm bringing that up is because that's the way it is in this tradition. Is there's this constant investment, and this investment comes straight from people who also are living their lives and paying their bills and have all of these other things. So there's this element of sacrifice and commitment that's really there. And when that sacrifice and commitment is there, to me, it's just such a beautiful thing because there's sincerity involved with it. There's this passion that you see in people like you where it's coming from their heart. It's coming from their soul. They're doing it because they want to do it.
Yeah. I agree with that entirely. I mean, I feel that, it's, as I'm sure, you guys do as well. It's quite a sacrifice, but on a deeper level, I feel like I've tried to run from this stuff before, and it just doesn't work out at a certain point. It's like, I really do feel like sometimes the path chooses you. Of course, we're always free to exercise our free will, but I don't think I couldn't do this. I wouldn't feel like a whole person.
That's true. And, in traditional cultures, for instance, if a medicine person is going to be initiated and they try and run from the training, the spirits usually mess them up. There'll be a sequence of misfortunes, or they'll get in an accident, or things just won't be working out. And then they'll go to the medicine person and be like, why can't I get anything to work in my life? And they'll be like, the spirits want you to be initiated. You have to be initiated. You don't have a choice. You have to be on the path. And there is that element of it, really. And the thing I love about the Western mystery tradition, the authentic aspects of it, are that most of these people, these beautiful, beautiful people, are working in this very humble way, mostly anonymously, not looking to be public figures, not looking to be big shots. And that's a wonderful thing. I mean, when I watch your show, listen to your podcast, you're focused on the material, and it's serious and it's scholarly. So it's beautiful because it's going to take the people who are listening, who are watching, on a journey into that material rather than a journey into your personality.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Trying to serve the traditions, and the big thing for me is that context is something that a lot of us are missing on the practical side. We're missing a tremendous amount of historical context, and what that allows us to do is sort of interpolate. So we get to, like I was saying earlier, we get to project our own expectations of what this is going to be. Well, if a system is to be viable, then there has to be some sort of objective, repeatable sort of outcome. And, you see it a lot where people will kind of branch off from the Golden Dawn. And I speak of the Golden Dawn now just because it's the one that I'm the most familiar with. But there's a ton of different splinter organizations, created by initiates who never got past the outer order. Well, the interesting thing is, like, you do not know the Golden Dawn if you've not been in the inner order. So, I mean, the outer order to a degree is a blind for the inner order. It's basically like sort of this outer court where it's testing you to see, like, are you going to stick around, and are you going to allow the processes of initiatic alchemy to break you down and then put yourself back together under the auspices of spirit? It's not really fleshed out because of how massive the span of time, how voluminous the contribution of literary work and thought that comprises the Western esoteric tradition. So most people don't even know that, like, when I'm talking about Plato, I'm talking about the Western esoteric tradition. They don't associate the two. When you talk about Marsilio Ficino, people like that, philosophers and artists, these people made a tremendous contribution to thought. And this was their primary motivation. The very things we are attempting to do in orders like this and in processes like this was at the forefront of literate society, for like most of the last 2,500 years at least. So, to kind of, we have this terrible issue in our day and age, it's a consequence of postmodernism, really. But we look back and we paint everything with the brush of our time, and what happens there is you're cutting off your roots. How could you, there's that thing, right? People who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. Like, so you're kind of severing yourself from what this is supposed to be. And I really feel like there's a really great concerted effort, especially lately within academia. There's a tremendous amount of serious erudition about it. But then, okay, there's kind of an imbalance on that side as well, because you're analyzing and dissecting, the material forms, the accoutrement, the physical body, and completely devoid of the spirit of the issue. And for anything to be a whole, it has to be, it has to be comprised of both of these things. So I'm attempting to, my thing is that I've worked for many years on my skills in articulation to be able to cultivate, linguistic skills and conceptual skills like analogy and things like that, to attempt to convey these things to a larger audience so that they're not so esoteric. Granted, at a certain point, the real secrets are not discursive. They're Gnostic, if they're anything. You partake of the higher mysteries via experience. But the scaffolding that we use to get there, to build to that experience, is important, and it is of consequence. And so that's really what I'm just trying to help give people the nuts and bolts for their scaffolding.
Nice. And I would say your goal of articulation is you're definitely doing a good job there, because you are able to articulate these ideas fairly clearly, and that's super important when you're trying to talk about such complex topics. And what you had just said reminded me of a conversation that you had on one of your episodes, actually. You were talking to Dr. Gregory Shaw. Great episode, by the way. We've had Mr. Shaw on our show a few times. Huge Greg Shaw fans here. Yeah.
We love him.
He's great.
Yeah, and you had a great conversation with him, and he was telling you a story about how he was giving a talk, and I think there was maybe a Catholic priest in the audience. And the priest was basically like, wow, everything you just talked about is what I'm doing in my mass. So the connections are there. It's a winding road that you really need to kind of study to kind of find all those different touch points. But yeah, I mean, there's a pretty clear path back. And then you go back, beyond theurgy, and you're looking at Egypt, and, it just keeps going. And so, we still have access to those kind of mysteries, which is great, but you really got to look.
Yeah. And to me, it's this sort of sequence. Look at a flower, for instance, right? A flowering plant, I should say, to be more specific, an ornamental. So you get it in its seed form, and then certain things have to happen in that seed form. It's gotta, it has to suffer. It has to, crack open, be planted in fertile ground, reach up towards the light, feel the warmth, grow as a seedling for a little while. And then finally, when the time is right, it has to bloom, And so people will look at different parts of that phase and say, well, or different, they'll look at different phases of that trajectory of growth and unfoldment and becoming. Right. Because the flower is the seed's purpose. And they'll say, well, these things aren't connected. And that's actually on both sides of the fence. That's the a lot of modern practitioners and certain academics, not all of them, but really to understand the trajectory of Western esotericism, like you're saying, from the sort of dark recesses of history, the historical record, up through Egypt, up through, Pythagorean Mediterranean, further into the Platonic tradition and the Italic Hermetic tradition, all that stuff, all the way to the modern day is really to the Christ event for me, is to not only know what it is, but to understand its telos. It's not just its ontology, but it's telos. Like what is its purpose?
I was literally just about to say that. I was literally thinking about that exact word, and I was about to say the purpose of the hermeneutic, the purpose of a hermetic interpreter is to lead one to the telos.
Absolutely.
And then you took it right out of my mouth, which just shows we're on the same consciousness.
Well, maybe you put it in my head.
I think Hermes put it in all of our heads.
There you go.
Because we dedicate this podcast to Hermes, and you certainly are one of the children of Hermes. And I didn't mean to interrupt you there, and I apologize for that. But I was just astonished that you were taking that, because the telos is such an important idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so important because the telos of the tree is the entire tree.
Yeah.
And the seed
exactly
contains that entire archetype of the tree. Literally within the seed is the archetypal telos of the entire tree and of tree-ness.
Yes.
And yet we have that seed inside of us as the Gnostic sphincter, the seed of light in the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Except the roots grow from above.
Right. It's the roots grow from above, but there's also us, reaching upward towards them. That's the most interesting thing about the consequence of duality is how we exercise free will, and it reminds me of, Michelangelo's famous painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And I've said this in other podcasts, but it's just so good. You see God reaching down, as if it's the most important thing in the world. And there's a host of angels behind him, and, his hair's blowing in the wind, and he's stretching forth, leaning. And Adam's just kind of hanging out there. He's just like, got his limp hand, just kind of like, yeah, these grapes are cool though. He's not as interested. So that's kind of also the motive spirit behind this, is because there's a lot of initiates who have been able to show me the telos, but I feel like I have an underlying. I'm trying to reach back towards God as hard as I know God is reaching down towards us. I'm trying. I'm only human, but I want to. I want to really bridge. I want to bridge the aisle, so to speak, between like the more, I want to say, theurgic or erudite practitioners, people that have contributed scholarly works and need a lot of that context in order to conduct what they do. And then I also want to, have people on the show that are serious practitioners for, multiple decades, but maybe are a little bit more intuitive in their practice. And again, it's just that I'm attempting to harmonize, and bring some kind of balance to something that I feel like could benefit from more of that in one instance. But the sort of the lecture or presentation style videos that I do, they're laying the foundation for Western esotericism. I have found that largely, like, one of the reasons why I went to Buddhism and Taoism first is because that was visible. It had high visibility when I was sort of spiritually coming of age. Mm-hmm. And so I went to that, and I did find over the course of several years that, the teachings had been convoluted, and there's all sorts of ego traps inherent to this dissociative idea of total transcendence of duality that is completely unpractical and actually inherently apathetic. So not interested in that necessarily. And then finally I stumble into the Western esoteric tradition, and it's not in great shape, at that point, years ago. It's you didn't have as much that was really available to contextualize what it was, orders like the Golden Dawn are trying to do. And so I try to take all the different sectors, and a lot of the people that I have on the podcast are people who inspired the actual work, the presentations that I gave. That's kind of how I thought to reach out. I thought to reach out to them, right? I was reading their books and reading their essays and things like that. So I just wanted to kind of rehab it in a way that made sense, right? Like is somewhat sequential. Again, this is such a massive swath of time, and it's such a huge portion of human history that there's no way to go about it completely, along a chronological scope. But I thought of, okay, when I first got involved in initiation, what was super important? And then beyond that, now that I'm at the other end, so to speak, I mean, I'm not done with initiation. It's probably a multiple lifetimes sort of trajectory. But now that I'm a little further down the line, I look back and I think to myself, well, what would have been helpful? And so, it started out exploring ideas on magic and, how to get started in ritual, just the bare bones do's and don'ts. And then from there, I started to develop the esoteric worldview. And that's essentially, I'm trying to build that foundation right now. And then from there, once there's like a place that, me and my audience and whoever else wants to participate eventually, once we're at a point where there's a really firm understanding about what this is and how everything works together for the most part, then I can start going off and just finding little niche areas of interest to discuss and flesh it out even further, but until I'm going to treat it like a course, like a college course, until we really lay the foundation, I'm not going to start talking about, Enochiana and things like that. It's just, we got to figure out what this is first.
Well, so let's say
I was gonna, do you got something, Janice? I had something.
Yeah, but you can go if you want. I can wait.
Okay. I was just going to say, let's go back for a second, because you said something interesting that I'd like to focus in on. I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on this idea that you mentioned, the transcendence of duality. And I think you wrote an article on it recently, which was interesting, on your blog. I believe that's where I saw it. Talk about this idea of transcending duality. It sounds like you're not all for that concept.
Well, I'm not, because it's not inherently theurgic, and that's kind of the path that I take. So theurgy is more of an ascent beyond duality, but then like to come back, right? It's and to work in the world. And there's this idea of, obviously, the Eastern idea of the bodhisattva, which is, it's interesting to me. I don't view the theurgist and the bodhisattva as the same thing, though, because the thing that I find different, and this could just be an ignorance stemming from a lack of experience of what I guess I've never been involved in any magical Eastern paths. And I know that there are magical Eastern paths, like whatever it is, Dzogchen Buddhism and that kind of stuff. But I've not done that. But I think that the major difference between the Western path and the Eastern path, because there's a tremendous, like an uncanny amount of consonance between the two. But where they differ is in this idea of transcendence. The Western theurgist, wants to be in the world, perhaps not of it, but wants to be in the world and spiritualize the world. And in order to do that, they utilize the constituent elements of the cosmos, right? The theurgist works with the planets. The theurgist works with the zodiac. The theurgist works with the elements. That's the basis of theurgy is the idea that, is, some people call it maybe geocentrism, but in reality, I find it to be georeferentiality. I have no other choice but to start in my physical body, in the physical location, where I find myself, and work my way upward and outward from there. And using that physical materia and having an understanding of the wheelwork, the hierarchies of creation, is what the Western esoteric tradition is all about. And a lot of that starts out as, morality. I would say in the Platonic tradition, from which much of this stuff really stems, right? Because he himself worked within an ultimately Pythagorean context, is the idea of arete and eudaimonia, excellence or virtue and well-being. And you have in later Platonism, Neoplatonism, kind of capitulated by Iamblichus, the ladder of virtue. You have this sort of sevenfold ascent to that, I want to say, experience of elevation or experience of ascent, but not complete transcendence. You come back down. It's a circuit. Mm-hmm. And we what we do in alchemical transmutation is, you're still working with stuff that was already there. It's the gold was in the, prima materia. It was in the dross. And so, for instance, a practical application of kind of working with or working after an experience of elevation, because it's something that happens, there's many circulations. It's not just a one bing bam, you're out and you're good to go thing. It's a multiple, you experience this thing as many times as you can. And but one of the aspects would be like, okay, I am aware now of this sort of aspect of my persona that I was not aware of before. And I bring it under control, and I am applying that, not casting it aside into the rubbish pile, but I am now applying that with knowledge, where it can be useful in society, where I, instead of having it go, a really good example of this is maybe like, I don't want to say anger, but I want to say passion, right? Passion. So you've got this kind of Eastern adept that is kind of lukewarm to things. Let's just say this archetype. Whereas, the goal, I think, of the theurgist is not to necessarily become completely dispassionate and therefore dissociative, but rather to use that passion where it was previously unchecked to cultivate something beautiful in the world, to apply it where it needs to go and where it can be useful. And I think that the only way that we can do that is by allowing ourselves in our physical bodies to be guided by the way I have put it before is, there are many names for this. You could call it the higher divine genius. You could call it the holy guardian angel, whatever you want to call it. But I like to refer to it as the aspect of our spiritual architecture which transcends our ego, to make some sort of contact with that, right? That's the explicit goal of the inner order of the Golden Dawn is that you do that you attempt, that you, with everything you have, this is it, and you don't stop until you persevere with courage and determination until that is effected. And then you become a vehicle for that in the world, and you literally spiritualize matter. So that to me is,
Can I stop you there?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So I just want to say this is, very important. This is core. This is important. This point you're making here. And it is part and parcel of the entire trajectory of the Western mystery tradition. The more I learn about this tradition and its antecedent, even pre-Christian elements, if you go back into the archaic Hellenic and Italic tradition, the genius is an extremely important part of this initiatic mystery. The Egypto-Greco-Romanic tradition that was in the Mediterranean, and it had centers in at Pompeii and Naples and other places. The genius is something genius being the root of the word genie, for instance, but it's something that is core not only in our individual life, but then it's also extremely important in our family life.
Mm-hmm.
And there's genie of nations, there's genie of religious bodies, because these are spirits. So we have our own genius. And I think it's important for people to understand sometimes that this goes back to our skills as interpreters. You have to help people understand that it's not just something. Like when we say holy guardian angel, that is a Abrahamic language, right, talking about, but really it is the same thing as the agathodaimon of the Greek, or of the Faustus genius of a Roman way of putting it. It's the same thing. It's this benevolent divine genius that really is us in our most pure form, but yet it's also beyond us and not us. And there's a mystery in the fact that this is us, but also not us. It's independent of us, yet it's what we really are in our most deep and true way. It's not just a philosophical abstraction of arete to aspire to or something like that. It's not an intellectual idea of self-perfection, although it inspires that motivation within us by its radiance in our lives. It is an actual intelligence. In Jung's, it's like in Jung's more religious writings, he talks about the star that leads the soul onward, and it's that star above our head, that shining radiant star, the blazing star above our head. That is our genius. And this is so important. I feel like so many younger esotericists, magicians, whatever you want to call it, mystics, if they would just start here at this point before you do anything else, just start here, start listening for that still small voice in the heart. Be aware of the fact that this being is more invested in you and your well-being and you achieving your highest potential than any other being in your matrix, really. That this being is emanated from the divine and set over you, and you can establish a relationship with this being and an interaction with this being, and by doing so in a mysterious way, you come to true self-knowledge.
I that was so beautifully said. I honestly, I couldn't even put it better myself. Can I quote you on my my show?
Yeah, sure.
That's fine. I'm long-winded. I think that is the most important thing that I have learned from the Western esoteric tradition. And you see it everywhere. It's the agathodaimon. It's Socrates' daimon, right? And it's also in the Picatrix, right? The Perso-Arabics, they called it perfect nature. And they said, just as you're saying, they said it exists exterior to, and it exists. There's a species of that which exists within us, right? It's the macrocosm and the microcosm. And even in the later Neoplatonic tradition, Proclus, in his commentaries, specifically says that the daimon is both exterior and interior to us. So that whole daimon, is it the holy guardian angel? Is it inside? Is it outside? It's clarified right there if you're looking, if you're one to just go based off of the textual stuff. So yes, 1,000 times yes. And what I think is really important to note about that experience is that it, at least in my experience, and many of the adepts of the that are pursuing that work, not all of them, but many of them, I've heard experiences that kind of corroborate my own, because I was feeling totally insane. My experience of my genius, my higher divine genius, has completely contradicted almost every single thing every preconceived notion that I had about what it meant to be a quote unquote spiritual person. Because a lot of that, right, was culled from movies, television, just these expectations that are mostly aesthetic in our culture, right? Unfortunately, there are great things about consumerism, but there's also this kind of thing where it's like, well, I'm only going to go skin deep with anything, because it's okay. I have that. The pin goes on my lapel and I go to the next thing. And the reality is that when you begin to, first of all, you can't turn it off, right? Like you were saying, Janus, to listen to this still small voice. Once you start hearing that, you're going to hear that forever.
And there's a thing too with that, because part of this work we're doing, in most of us who have done this work and who are actively engaged in it, because I don't think you ever stop this particular project. There are esoteric projects you do, and then you succeed, and then you move on to the next thing. But then there's things that you're literally doing for the rest of your life, and this is one of those things.
Right.
You have to learn in the earlier phases of it, especially. Part of it is learning to distinguish between the automatic functioning of your habitual personality expressing itself through the analytical, intellectual function of the rational mind, because that will mimic what you're trying. You'll be trying to communicate with your genius, and the rational mind will try and mimic that.
Right.
Because everyone has internal dialogue. That is not the genius. However, when that part of yourself, the mind, is the phrenic mind in Greek,
right,
rather than
the wise mind. Yeah.
When the mind is entrained to the angel, then the angel is able to speak through that part of you too. The angel can use your mind as a transductive receiver and speak to you, but first your analytical function has to become adapted to the influence of the genius, and then the genius can communicate to you through that. But usually I find that it speaks as an objective voice, which you learn to recognize. It goes from being still and small to being clear, because you're attuning yourself to this influence. And it is such a beautiful thing, because this being, this angel, this genius, this daimon, is a confessor for you too. When you're crying, when you're having a hard time, when life is hurting, you go to your genius and you talk to them. And I have had miraculous experiences through confiding in my genius. My genius knows me better than anyone else, and I trust my genius more than any other being, just about, except for, of course, the supreme, in God. And of course, I completely trust Thoth. I completely trust Hermes. I love him with all of my heart. But I would not say that my genius is separate from him and the spirits that serve him, because spirits form the body of a god in a certain way as their emanations. But that being, you can trust your genius, you can confide in your genius. If you're having trouble understanding something in your life, you go to your genius. If you're trying to make an important decision, go to your genius. If you're trying to understand some weird dreams you had, go to your genius. Go lay down in your bed, go sit in your chair, have a moment of meditation, silence your inner dialogue, be quiet and listen, and an answer will come. And the more you do that, the more the darkness of your mind will become illuminated by the influence of this wonderful, wonderful thing that to me, it is like having it's just evidence of providence to me, the fact that we have this.
Yeah, it's certainly evidence, of some kind of omnibenevolence, which maybe we don't see in the demiurgic creator, but certainly this is the emissary of that which is omnibenevolent and above, the demiurgic influence. And that's why it's so important that we ascend, and it reaches down. We reach up, it reaches down. And as you were saying, that's the whole point of traversing the middle pillar on the tree of life for anybody who's a Kabbalist. It's because the sphere of Tifereth, right? Like you were saying, it's in the heart. That is the chamber, the bridal chamber, that's where that intelligence comes down, that part of you, that genius will meet you there. And as you're saying, for me, it started out as a still small voice and kind of mental pictures. And as I grew in my interaction with it, it's now immediate. If typically it's not going to, it communicates with me in several different ways, right? I mean, there's synchronicity, which is huge. I'm constantly having conversations with my environment. I'm constantly interpreting my environment, and it speaks back, it speaks to me. It will initiate a conversation in a way that mimics very similarly, like anyone who's familiar working with the tarot, there's kind of this egregore underneath it. The cards will speak to you once you have a relationship. Well, my genius speaks to me through my surroundings as well as the voice, and it's I have found actually, Janus, that in moments when I am really suffering, it's right there. It's right there. When I ask with a heart full of sorrow and eyes full of tears, why? I get an answer immediately, and it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. And the thing is, like, why not try and share, the road there, these techniques and this ultimate trajectory that, I mean, everyone has been talking about, everyone of consequence in Western spiritual traditions has been talking about for 2,500 years, so that's, to me, it's, I'm trying to, you asked me earlier, Dom, what am I really trying? What trajectory, what tack am I taking with the channel? I'm trying to get enough established to where I can kind of lead people in that direction, the direction of theurgy, the direction of the genius. And it's not to say that anything else is invalid, because it's all part of, it's all part of the all. And yeah, sometimes it's the more egotistical things, and it's the more maybe immediate financial or whatever, what have you. Sometimes it's those things which lead us to the foot of the holy mountain, so to speak. So you can't. I'm not trying to be derisive about it or dismissive of those things, but I certainly feel like the theurgic path is one that it's one you should undertake before long, and I would just want to make that for whoever is who is ready for that. I want to make these things available and try and amplify their presence in the overarching dialogue.
Sure, and there are certainly things that can take you off that path, like you were saying, the search for material gain and whatnot could be totally aligned with a more pure goal, but if you are getting a little bit too attached to the passions, to the desires, I mean, that's leading in a different direction. Similar techniques, perhaps. And that's where it can become difficult. Is this theurgy? Is this something else? How much has being a musician helped you tap into this current, or tap into these kind of lucid ideas that you've been expressing?
I'm not 100% sure. I thought I was at one point, but I realized that I look back and I thought for a while that my, well, I'll put it this way. I feel that people who, and I don't even think this is necessarily just true for people who make music. I think it's true for people who feel very deeply when they hear a piece of music as well. But I think musicians just typically spend more time in that headspace, trying to craft something. We need to get in touch with something interior as musicians, something that's kind of moving through us. And a lot of times when we try and plan things out, they don't have that, they call it, right, a spirit of genius, a spirit of inspiration. They don't necessarily have that when you're sort of beating an idea to death. And so you get practice on kind of being still for a little while, as Jana said earlier, and quieting the discursive mind, right? Because it's sound at that point. And then if anything, the mental representation can be color, it can be feeling, it can be sort of vignettes from memory. So now you're activating all these kind of like non-rational or non-logical effects or faculties. Really, they're faculties in your psyche. And so when you activate those things, you kind of, after a while, you become aware that like, oh, it's really interesting that I have this kind of this circuit of sound, color, emotion, and no words at any point were involved. but there was a definite powerful experience there.
Mhm.
I
No
think
words were harmed in the filming of this podcast.
right. Yeah. Maybe not. We're not at the end yet, but I think that helps kind of develop things like intuition and non-discursive, psychic processes, or at least encourage them.
Mhm.
But I think also, I read the Platonic dialogues really, really young, and I didn't understand them. My dad just kind of gifted them to me. One of the first books I could read when I was of age to sort of, I'm not reading The Cat in the Hat anymore, or what, The Stinky Cheese Man. I'm not reading those books anymore. I jumped right into Five Great Dialogues by Plato, and I didn't understand them mystically back then, but they certainly influenced my ability at an early age to think abstractly, and that's something I developed very quietly, intimately with myself in my interior. It happened over the course of my late teenage years and throughout my 20s. I engaged in this almost Socratic dialogue with myself, and really pushed myself to think abstractly, and that also really, really helps. So I don't think I can just pin it all on music, but I think those two things together really help me grasp this stuff. And then, of course, you reach that point where, like, yeah, okay, I understand this stuff, but now how the hell do I talk about it? And that's where the real challenge begins.
So I want to jump in, and it's so funny that you said something a subject ago. It was so connected to something I was just reading and reflecting on earlier in the day. So if you don't mind, I'll just read you a quick quote.
Oh, yeah, sure.
This is from the, I feel, underappreciated, brilliant master Oswald Wirth in his writing upon the sixth arcanum of the Tarot. So Arcana 6 as a whole illustrates the mechanism of the voluntary act of the sentient person portrayed by the lover, who is the man of desire of San Martin. This personality receives the impressions of the physical world thanks to his sensitivity, which is the green color of his costume, and then he reacts, the red color, compulsion. Now, as it is not a matter of unconscious or automatic acts called reflex, there is deliberation and choice before the releasing of the action is decided upon. And then a little forward here. The wisdom is not that of the initiated who identify life with fruitful action, useful Herculean work. To live for its own sake is not their ideal, for they feel that they are artists and consider that life is given to them with the view of creating a work of art. As it is a question of the great work of humanity to which only the workers of the spirit can devote themselves, they must have learned how to will and how to love. The lover is in this respect the initiate whose apprenticeship is completed. If, by crossing his arms, he puts himself in the rank of the good shepherd known to the Knights of the Rosy Cross, the fact is that he tries to forget himself. He does not allow himself to realize his own personal benefit, but desires only that of others. It is this realization of this moral beauty which corresponds to the sixth Sephira, Tifereth, whose emblem is Solomon's seal, formed by two entwined triangles. In this we must see an allusion to the marriage of the human soul, water, and the divine spirit, fire. It is the star of the macrocosm, the sign of supreme magical power acquired by the individual who with complete self-abnegation puts himself in the service of the whole. To love to the point of existing only for others, that is the objective of the lover. And I hear this message in what you're talking about just through this whole conversation. I hear this aspiration and this motivation and what you're discussing. It really is very heart-centered and Tifereth-centered. And I feel like all of the subjects we're discussing in this discussion are really centered upon that passage I just read.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I feel like it doesn't really matter how many physical initiations you undergo and how many ceremonies are put on for you. I think that the real, those things can be powerful catalysts, and they're certainly powerful as magnets, right? Because you're stating a very powerful intention when you go through a ritual, or even when you put one on for somebody in sincerity. But the real initiation happens in your heart, And I think that is the sine qua non of the adept of any tradition. It's the activation of the heart. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't become angry anymore, or you don't become upset or mad, right? Because it's passions are in the heart too. That fire is there, but it's just the redirection of that fire towards the most beneficial end. And typically it comes with a self-abnegation to say, okay, I don't know how to act in this situation. Guide me, send my energies where they need to go. It's a tremendous amount of trust. And, but the thing is, when you're aligned with that heart-centered intention, right? You don't want to gratify yourself in this situation. You just want to serve, however that's going to work out. I have found in my own subjective experience that it always works out for the best when you just get out of the way. So, and yeah, you're being guided by, like I said earlier, I truly believe that the genius is the emissary of the omnibenevolent, transcendent God. I really do. And I see in the genius a very, very powerful analogy for Christ. And that's why unabashedly I am a Christian.
Well, that gets into something very significant here. In this internet age of the tabloidification of Gnosticism, people don't understand that it was and continues to be a legitimate tradition, and that the primitive Christians who used the term gnostikoi did not use it as a social marker or identifier, but as an indicator that they had attained the experience of direct contact with the divine. It wasn't a social signifier. It was an indication of the triumph over the lower self had been attained. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because in this tradition, there's deeper elaborations upon the more simple aspects of Christian tradition. For instance, the idea of the demiurge. Most people who are interested in Gnosticism don't understand that there are several demiurges. Even within the Christian Gnostic tradition, the first demiurge is deposed from his throne and is cast to the earth or Hades. And a second demiurge, who is in harmony with heaven, with the pleroma, is put in his place. And that demiurge establishes a system of benevolent angelic influences that are placed over the planetary chains and hierarchies and souls. And the genius is part of this system, the secondary system of justice established in the world, which has been established by the second demiurge, who operates directly under the command of Sophia. And those angels in the Valentinian tradition, the benevolent geniuses, are said to be conceived by the union of Christ and Sophia in the bridal chamber. So this is all part of the tradition, but
yeah, and you see it even in this is so, to me, reminiscent of the Lurianic Kabbalah, right? Which is we're talking now about the first and second creations. The first creation kind of being deposed, not being able to contain the light, and therefore being, right, the shards are cast down, literally, right, they occupy a space contiguous to and below the material sphere, like kind of.
That's so insightful. That's such a great point.
Yeah, so it's and where does really Kabbalah come from? It comes from the Hellenized Judaism of the Alexandrian period, which is where we find all of the Valentinian, Basilidian, the Nag Hammadi codices, all that stuff is in Alexandria. It was found in Alexandria. All those teachers were there. So there's a very special thing happening in that place and time, and it's all one tradition. It's all extremely consonant. When you really look at it, there's not as much variety, as we think there is. Everybody's trying to say the same thing through, I guess, the language of their own inherent culture.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That is definitely our position as well. It's an inevitable conclusion after you study these things in enough depth.
Right. Exactly. And that's also something I'm kind of on the sly trying to push in there, because the thing is, I respect a lot of, I totally respect the nuance that goes into these scholarly erudition, and this idea that like, but the issue is, and I will never, I'm not a Crowley fan. I'm just not. Anybody who's watched my channel for more than 5 minutes knows that about me. So it's
well, you're in the same boat with us,
right.
And we'll leave it at that.
but I'll say that he has one incredible insight in book 4, and again, I think it's because his thoughts for that book were organized for him. He dictated it, and somebody else organized the content. I think that was a big reason why that happens to be his most lucid writing. He basically talks about the rational mind being, corresponded to the suit of daggers or swords in the tarot, and how it's a very fitting emblem because the mind, the rational mind wants to analyze, right? And the archaic meaning of analysis is to take apart, to cut up. We think, you hear analysis in a modern context and you're thinking, oh, I'll crunch the numbers, I'll think on it. But the actual meaning of analysis is to take apart. And that's what the rational mind does. And the whole thing is that you're never going to come to a holistic picture of things by cutting everything into ever smaller pieces. Thank you very much, Aristotle, for that. The first philosophical error. But the issue is that so much of that kind of pervasive nominalism has taken over and really obscured what we're talking about, that inevitable conclusion by saying, well, this is slightly different, and this has different cultural underpinnings, and well, this was happening in a different time. It's like, yeah, but you're not reading the spirit of the letter here, and that's the whole reason they wrote any of this shit. So it's not just this anthropological cultural phenomenon. It's right. There's something very, very, very central and of like urgent, imminent importance to human beings that people have been trying to pull down out of noetic realms and concretize here to leave for other people, and things happen, time passes, things get destroyed, texts get burnt, language becomes archaic, completely obscure. So this is really the work of the modern scholar practitioner, is to resurrect the teachings with insight.
Absolutely, and you put it very eloquently there. Like 60-Second Assassin said, truth out the blue, and it still ain't nothing new. And it's true. Like the truth remains the same. Truth is not mutable. Truth is not changeable. The truth is the truth is the truth. And when you're dealing with people who were and are having interior mystical experiences of direct revelation, a perception of the inner realm, their experiences, there will be an inner consistency. We need to dismiss the nonsense of relativity. And
right.
And also historically,
Absolutely.
It's easy to establish certain things, right? Like the Septuagint, that the Old Testament was translated into Greek. That is when Tamura, Notarikon, Gematria were introduced to Hellenized Jews, because those are originally Greek Pythagorean techniques in Esosophia. It's part of Pythagorean mysticism, which was an aspect of Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. If you read the early, I don't even like using the term Gnosticism because there are certain channels out there that really tabloidify it these days. But when I say Gnosticism, what I really mean is pre-Nicene primitive Christianity, because it was an integral aspect of the original and true tradition. Thus, we see Clement of Alexandria, one of the most subtle and mystical Christian fathers, referring to himself as a Gnostic. He says that he even gives you in his writings, he talks about what a Gnostic is, and it's essentially centered upon a love for truth and spiritual devotion. But anyway, in Alexandria, all of these things were brought into the Hebrew tradition, and this is why you see contemporaneous writings from Jews in other areas criticizing the Hellenized Jews of this area at the time, because they were saying these Jews are bringing all these things that aren't Jewish into the Jewish tradition. So we can easily establish that many of these things we find in later Kabbalah came from the Pythagoreanism, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism.
Yeah.
And that is actually useful because then we can identify, okay, well, what was original to their tradition? And that's the Merkabah.
Right. Yes, exactly. And even that was based on like an ascent through 7 planetary spheres where like they that they met quote unquote hostile angels. They had to beat the boss of the planet to like move forward. Which is it's just unbelievable. But it's and that's the whole thing. Like, so this stuff really has a Hellenic basis, all of it. Because the thing is, like, okay, I understand the idea behind oral traditions, right? I get it, right? The mouth to ear definitely exists, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of the stuff, particularly like the Sefer Yetzirah and things like that, we're basing it off of the oral tradition of dating it. We can't, we don't really know how far back that thing goes back. There's no historical or scholarly consensus, and that's what those people are typically good at. Now, the Zohar, obviously, I believe it's the 1300s, Moses de Leon. So what we do have extant, not in the culture and in the historical records, the Pythagorean stuff outdates it by like 1,000 years at least. So,
precisely.
And then the interesting thing is, of course, as I believe Dom was saying earlier, well, the historical attestations, right? Porphyry's and Iamblichus's various lives that they wrote, right? Vita Pythagoreae and the Life of Plotinus, particularly like the best and brightest of ancient Greece, Thales, Solon, Plato, Pythagoras, they're all attested to have undergone initiation in Egypt, and specifically working with the priestcraft, right? Because the priestcraft it's not like clergy that we think of today. They were doing everything. There were physician priests, there were botanist priests, there were metallurgist priests, there were scribe priests. So to become educated, you had to work with priests. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that what do all the priests have in common? They're priests. So there's an overarching spiritual discipline, a perspective lens, or I would say an insight that is prerequisite to being a member of the priestly class. And that is a lover of wisdom, a lover of knowledge, right? To me, the Egyptian priest class, as far as we can go back, those were the first philosophers. The Greeks learned how to do philosophy from them.
And the greatest philosophers among the Greeks directly said this. They directly acknowledged this. They were constantly acknowledging that Egypt was the place where all wisdom came from at the time. And that's also why I think that we need to divest ourselves from these pernicious Old Testament myths of these evil Egyptians.
Yeah.
Why would I believe when I'm reading this slander? If I know someone hates someone else, I'm not going to listen to it's kind of like reading the church fathers to get accounts of the Gnostics. It's a very similar thing, really, because why would you listen to that? Why would you believe that? No, when every other culture was saying Egypt is heaven on earth, Egypt is the source of all knowledge, Egypt is the most hygienic country.
Yeah, I mean, and even among the Hebraic settlements, if you look at the archaeological evidence, they had their own quarters, they had their own foods. They weren't like like house slaves to these people. It almost seems as if it was like kind of a mutually beneficial relationship. Like, okay, we offer you the auspices of our empire and protection and food and that kind of thing. And you guys, we need help doing work. So being in Egypt and spending some time there and traveling around with an Egyptologist, it made a lot of valid points about it, particularly that, and some people will disagree with this, but I found this to be kind of apropos. He said, one of the things that astounds people about Egyptian work in particular is its degree of perfection at such a quote unquote early point in time on the historical record. And, he points out, he's like, do you really believe, especially people back then who, didn't have necessarily the same kind of aversion to the after or to death because of some things like the afterlife, were just part and parcel of their worldview. They didn't even have to, think, do I believe in that? Do you really think that, he asked me, that slaves could accomplish work to this degree of magnitude of perfection? So that was one of their defenses. The other one was, talking about the archaeological evidence that, like, they had their own communities and things like that. You don't normally find like these kind of miniature autonomous societies within societies, if we're talking about slaves. So those were two interesting points that I've been chewing on.
Also, and those are excellent points. And another point we need to take into account is this: when we look at the historical timeline, when we look at the events of history, the Egyptians, they didn't go out looking for slaves. What usually happened is that they had to deal with others in either a military sense or people invading them, and then they would conquer them and enslave them because they were the superior culture. This is what happened with the Hyksos. This is what happened with these Habiru tribes who were living in the desert. They had a habit of trying to invade Egypt, and then the Egyptians would have no other choice but to enslave them. I mean, they were running into Egypt, trying to take over Egypt, and then they became enslaved, and then they wrote books about how the Egyptians were abusing them.
Right.
Let's not like totally gloss over Egypt as like these perfect angelic, society, utopian society. I mean, they were definitely a warlike society that had its own. I mean, they were certainly infused with this spirituality, but often a lot of these cultures were. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. They were vying for resources and stuff. So there was a lot of just mundane war stuff going on too. So I definitely don't want to get too much into the romanticization. Can't say that right now, of Egypt in that way. But it is interesting too, just to really quickly dovetail on what you guys had mentioned earlier, is that Egypt had so informed the Hellenic world, and then in turn later the Hellenic world then was informing Egypt.
Right.
But continue.
And I don't want to seem unreasonable. I mean, but the thing is, war was a reality as it is today, but of that time especially, it was a reality of the ancient world. So
yeah, and you also have to remember, we're talking about millennia here. So it's like we're talking about different generations of rulers, different epochs. For instance, Hatshepsut, right? The one of the female pharaohs of Egypt. She took upon her the title pharaoh, and she wore the false beard of the pharaohs. And her reign was typified by peace, and she was a really, really good businesswoman. She, at her mortuary temple, there are frescoes and designs. It's incredible that they're visible after such a massive amount of time. But you can see, like, to commemorate her reign, there's drawings of or paintings of her delivering grain and to a foreign nation, and so she brokering all these interesting deals and really bringing it to a time of prosperity through the sort of business-like sort of commerce politics, whereas her son was, I'm forgetting his name right now, but he was considered to be, so not the Egyptians revere her for bringing to Egypt a period of prosperity that was kind of had been lacking in Egypt, but she also gave them, and they're equally as happy about this, as one of the greatest. I'm pretty sure it was Hatshepsut, but I'm pretty sure she bore one of the greatest warriors in Egypt, and so they were super proud of that because, as Janice is saying, war was a reality for them. They were surrounded by people who that's just right. More money, more problems type of thing.
Mhm.
Prosperity comes, and then you have to go to war and defend these things. But I definitely do agree that, the overarching sentiments of each dynastic period are subject to change.
Yeah,
They definitely. I mean,
totally.
look at the Amarna period, right? Akhenaten, and just forcing everybody, moving the capital, forcing everybody to have this really, really strict monotheistic focus of worship. That to them at the time was a catastrophe.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's totally imbued with the potential for things to change. But I do agree that we do have to question narratives, because you find that a lot. They do say, like, winners write the history books. So we're finding more and more each day, and context is important, and dialogue like this is important.
Yeah, humans are going to human.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing too is for the West has been held in the grip of a specific narrative for a very long time, and it's informed so much of our academic research, so much also of the Western mystery tradition, and this narrative. And full disclosure, I am a clergyman within an Abrahamic tradition. So I'm saying this from within an Abrahamic tradition, and within a tradition that operates in at least a partially Abrahamic context. And I'm saying that this narrative should be questioned. I think it's held a stranglehold because of the cultural hegemony it's had on our understanding of history for far too long. And so for far too long, even hundreds of years of scholarship, things like what we're discussing with the Egyptian and Hellenic perspective have been sidelined and neglected if they contradict or question this narrative. And it's time for us to uproot the elements of this narrative that are fallacious in favor of the truth. The truth should be our objective in everything. We should always be striving for the truth and looking for what we can actually establish as factual. So it's not necessarily that I'm coming from a bias. My bias is the truth. My bias is, look, if you look at Egyptian temple theurgy, sacramental theurgy, Egyptian sacramental theurgy, and you are familiar with the structure of the liturgy, if you're familiar with the structure of the traditional either Western or Eastern liturgy, Eastern, especially in its iteration in what used to be called Constantinople, in Byzantium, or in the older, the more, I would say, more true forms of the Western liturgy, and then you develop an understanding of Egyptian sacramental temple theurgy, you will see it will become unquestionable that the central rite of the Christian mysteries must originate in Egyptian temple practice. And not only that, if we look at R.A. Schwaller de Lubis, we can also see a correlation so close as, now I know that correlation doesn't imply causation, but when we see the way that Christian churches were designed from the beginning of the movement, and then we understand the principles that Egyptian temples were designed upon, there is no way to not see a correlation that seems to suggest an inheritance of a body of knowledge.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to me too, because all those Coptic Gnostic, as you are saying, really a better term for it is sort of pre-Nicene primitive Christianity. All that stuff was found like right outside of Alexandria, and that was the seed bed, the seeding ground for Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Hermetism. All this stuff was happening. So to me, it's almost like, I don't know if you're familiar with music theory. I might get a little esoteric, but the basic premise of there's this thing called overtones, basically just harmonics. You have two notes that are sounded simultaneously, and the interaction of those two notes essentially creates a third note that you can hear. And I feel in some way that, and this is completely unsubstantiated maybe not completely, but it's definitely more of a feeling. I'm not ready to go on record and say I can point to the documents and yada yada yada. But my feeling is that Neoplatonism and Hermetism, basically the Platonic tradition, I want to say truly, whether it's Neoplatonism, Middle Platonism, whatever it is, but when the Platonic tradition and Hermetism began to encounter one another, I believe that Christianity was that third thing that sounded, that third note that was necessarily created. And that's it's not to imply that that I believe in, more of a strictly symbolic interpretation of the Christ event itself. I'm not trying to say that that's the case, but I definitely believe that a lot of those spiritual traditions capitulated into what you're talking about right now, this received body of knowledge that is well established. Because absolutely, I've walked into temples that are east facing in Egypt with an altar, and they tell you, the Egyptologists know exactly, they process in from the west, they face east. It's a very similar thing, it's the same thing in a Catholic church. I'm Catholic, I grew up Catholic, and so I'm just sitting there scratching my head, like, we're kind of doing magic all the time too.
Yeah, well, and as a priest, you walk into one of these temples and you're like, oh, I could just walk right up and do mass right now at this altar. Everything's set up just right.
Yeah. You just got to keep some consecrated hosts in your pocket.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, in there's a Byzantine, in the Byzantine liturgy, they would do this stational liturgy where they would have, sometimes they'd have a deacon moving around the city. The center church would consecrate the hosts, and then the deacon would go to the other churches, and then they would also do this thing where they would literally process in a circular way around the entire city with the hosts. It's just so solar. They'd move in this clockwise way through the streets of the city from each church to each church. If that's not for those people who understand ceremonial magic, there's just no way to deny the nature of the solar theurgy that's being practiced in these contexts. And I would also say, you were saying, I'm not denying the symbolical nature of Christ. Well, there's early scientific, around the time of Darwin, there's I think maybe Haeckel, but I don't want to say, I might be wrong about that, but there's a term, phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny. And so if you think about that, right, like the genesis of you can see it in the genesis of a baby in a mother's womb, and the way that the genesis of the baby in the mother's womb, it directly parallels the genesis of a chicken and an alligator and maybe a bear up into a certain period. The fetuses all look the same, and in turn the genesis of these fetuses recapitulate the genesis of life on Earth, from one-celled organisms to tadpole-like organism to amphibious to a land-dwelling organism. You see that process recapitulated in the development of the child within the womb. In the same way, the event of the Christos and his sacramental descent into matter, and the subsequent explosion and release of the life forces throughout the cosmos at the crucifixion. This is, in the spiritual life of the mystic, this entire process of the descent of the light and then the emanation of the light is recapitulated. Phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny. We have to conceive God within ourselves and give birth to God. As I think Meister Eckhart said, we have to conceive God and give birth to God within ourselves, or the incarnation and descent of God has no meaning for us. We have to participate in that by becoming pure and receptive mirrors, the unclouded, pure, receptive mirrors of the transcendental light of the flowing nature of the Godhead.
Right. Yeah, and you even see that kind of trajectory, as you were saying, this growth towards this certain release of life energy, and obviously in the crucifixion and right, the resurrection to the true life, the conquering of death. You see it in Western initiatic orders even. So you go through typically an outer order, and I'm talking now about a certain branch of the Western esoteric tradition, basically the GD and derivative orders. You undergo a series of initiations which recapitulate, Hebraic rites, Samothracian rites, Egyptian rites, but the main event is Christianity, and the thing is, people go through the outer order and they have this hodgepodge, this kind of sampling of all these different cultural, really cool rituals, and that come with their own things called oracles, and it's very interesting. And then, but if they don't penetrate the veil, and they don't enter into Kabbalistically the Sanctum Sanctorum, right, the chamber of Tifereth, you don't understand that like this entire thing was a recapitulation of the spiritual history of humanity, and that the capstone was the Christian mysteries. You didn't get there. So now it's like we're out here in the woods doing other stuff, when in reality, interpolations, as Dom had said earlier, are taking us off the specific path. This was specifically supposed to lead somewhere, and now we're elsewhere, as you said earlier, Dom. But we got distracted.
Well, it also proves, for instance, that Crowley was a lower level initiate, if initiated at all, because of his attitude toward Christ being quote unquote old aeon. Not only is that just it's not only inaccurate because it's reductive, but it's also inaccurate contextually. It just shows that he didn't even understand initiation itself to say something like that. And he didn't understand the nature of Christ. This is why in the early Christian, because there's no said old aeon, the primitive Christians were the ones talking about the procession of the aeons. That's where the whole concept came from, and was popularized, was in early mystical Christianity. Even if you look at the writings of Mani, he talks about the fact that and this comes from Zoroastrianism with the doctrine of the Seoshyant, the savior who incarnates once at the beginning of time, once midway through history, and once at the end of history. But it's the same savior, and you find that in the Semitic tradition with Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, being in the mystical Gnostic tradition, he's the first incarnation of Christ. Where I'm going with this is that to the primitive Christians, you had Hellenic Christians, you had Jewish Christians, you had Chaldean Christians, you had Egyptian Christians. Each of these people, they understood the Christian mysteries through their culture and in their cultural way, because this movement originally was not limited. It was understood, like you're saying, that this event was literally an event horizon. It was a transformative juncture in time and space. And Philip K. Dick said the same thing. Yeah. And so for each one of these cultures, it still had the supreme importance. Jewish Christians, Christ is still Christ. Hellenic Christians, Christ is still Christ.
Yeah. And it's not to dwell too long on Crowley, but it's interesting because here's the thing, right? So Christ also says, pick up your cross and follow me in my way. You're not worthy of me, and so that call to sacrifice and self-abnegation and creating a silent space at an interior level in the heart, what we were talking about, towards the beginning of this conversation, that's the giving birth to God. That's the creating a space where, the Christic force, that is available to you, is able to incarnate and use you and in the world. And the thing is, you don't really see that in Crowley's writings. He was not able. I do believe he tried, but I don't think he was able to sacrifice himself fully. And you have to sacrifice yourself fully, right? Because but you end up being, reinvested. But to the newer life, you're born again to the newer life, but you have life. And it seems like this really terrifying thing. Like I got to give myself up, but at the end of the day, like you're still here.
Right.
It's just you're gold now.
And that is one of the criticisms of mysticism by ignorant so-called Western left-hand path practitioners, is that, oh, well, mysticism means, you lose yourself and you're just dissolving into the... I've heard this argument ad nauseum so much over the past 20 years, and it just betrays a complete lack of understanding of what you're describing. It is not a loss of self. It is not you don't who would want to just be erased?
Right.
Why would you spend all this time meditating or praying or practicing theurgy just so you could walk into the big eraser and just be erased and stop existing and just merge into some ocean and be nothing? That's not the way this works.
Well, that's why I kind of going back again to some of the things we were talking about this kind of like Western version of Eastern transcendence. That's what a lot of that stuff gets, I think, mistakenly contextualized as. So you get a lot of Western people that don't have the cultural nuance necessary to really be able to parse and deeply, profoundly understand Eastern traditions. And so what happens is there's this prolonged period of personality erasure that happens over time, and you see this really strange dissociation take over. I was on that path for a long time, and it starts to slowly erase you. And whereas that's not the path of the Westerner, I truly don't believe that's the Eastern path either. I think we have accidentally sort of taken it that way. That's why I'm like, okay, it's fine. Continue your yoga, but also come here. Check this stuff out. Check out the Hellenistic stuff. Read the theurgic manuals. This is where it's really at for us. And so that's to sum that up. I agree with you wholeheartedly here. You're speaking my language, and I'm giving you a big hug from across the internet right now. So.
Well, I'd say personality erasure is okay, as long as what's being erased are all of the negative traits, all the negative attachments, all the negative, things that are dragging us down. So I feel like a lot of people hold on to these negative traits about themselves as if that's what defines them. Like, I've been through all this stuff and that's who I am. And to a degree it is, but they hold on to this baggage as if it's important to define who they are. And I think that's where the problem is potentially with not wanting to let go of the self. It may not be letting go of the entire self, but you should be letting go of aspects of yourself, for sure. And that kind of plays into the whole morality, ethics, virtue thing. You don't have to hold on to those things, and it is scary because you think, well, that's what makes me. Well, not really.
Dom, I'm so glad you said that, because that was on the tip of my tongue, and I was trying to think for a minute of how to put the way you put it's better than I could have. And I think that it's important to understand, for instance, in the Hindu tradition, and which passed into the Buddhist tradition, the seeds of karma are in the storehouse of the mind. Okay, so the mind, and Oswald Wirth likens this to two cards, the Hermit and the Empress, actually, for different reasons. But the seeds of karmas are in the mind. So the habitual personality is like this process, really, that occurs from an accumulation of our experiences and our decisions and our actions. And so people tend to identify with this habitual personality instead of being expressive of the indwelling, the light of the indwelling consciousness. And I agree. I think that it is important to eliminate the imperfections of the personality and refine the rough ashlar, so to speak, refine the stone, chip away at the stone. And I think that to go back to what we were talking about before, that is why the daimon, the genius, the holy guardian angel is so helpful too. Because you can go, please help me to see in my blind spots. Help me to please intercede with, you can say with God or with whatever, say you worship Hermes or Thoth. Please ask Thoth to correct this imperfection in my character, or to give me strength where there is weakness so that I can transcend this, and things like that. I think that the guardian angel is very helpful in this process, because they can also turn your attention to parts of yourself that you avoid seeing, because it hurts to see where we're ugly, and it hurts to see where we're broken, and it hurts to see where we're weak, and it hurts to see where we hurt others. And if we can just if we can just eliminate those influences from our personality, which according to an archaic worldview are sometimes originate in kakodaimones, in
Yes.
lower daimons. Possession is not always something that is this overt, dramatic horror movie style thing. Possession can occur on very subtle levels, and the possession usually occurs through the irrational passions.
Yes, and going back to kind of what we were saying earlier, that voice, that interior voice, it sounds like you.
Yep.
When the Kako Daimon, the guide of bad counsel, speaks to you, it sounds like you. There's a huge amount of deception, and that's why these things are so insidious, so pernicious. As you're saying, I mean, I personally, possession is a very real thing for me, and there are different degrees of it. There are different levels of it that are occurring. And it's the same way when you talk to somebody that maybe like, okay, somebody is considers themselves like overshadowed by a specific spirit or something like that. And there are some people who consider themselves hosts to certain deities or certain essences or powers, and they do that in the spirit of benevolence. Well, on the different levels or species of allowing something in, that also translates to the negative stuff. It's just often, we don't consciously invite the negative stuff in. We do it by, society has created a vast playground of opportunities for that to happen.
Nicely put.
They've created it a likelihood, actually, but in reality, we don't. It's not typical. I guess I've not been on the Goetic Reddit forums lately because I was about to say it's not likely people are asking evil things to kind of come into them, but
I'm sure they are.
It's getting more and more
absolutely
common.
They do it.
Yeah.
Let's put it this way. I'm not going to name any names, but there was a well-known author that people just fawned over, sycophants, who wrote on these subjects, and he was an intelligent person and a good writer, and really did make some valuable contributions in terms of his ideas. This person in his private life was not clean, and he was poor, he was sick, he was addicted to speed, he was not a role model, and he's writing books about basically worshiping demons and giving these complex philosophical justifications for them, and complex and these justifications for why, since this is an archaic tradition, you should dispense with the exorcistic aspects of dealing with goetic spirits and things like that. And now there's all kinds of people doing this work where they go, oh, well, that's just a Christian overlay. And it's like, do you understand that prior to Christianity, the theurgists who were dealing with these spirits were also using similar techniques, just with a different cultural overlay? And this guy, and people memorialize him like he was a saint. And these are the things that unfortunately contribute to disorder in society.
Yeah. It's always amazing to me that people don't see, like, basically the grimoire stuff it's there in the PGM, the phylacteries, the circles, the names, it's like, it's not Christian. It's just, through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the appropriation of these techniques sort of clandestinely by really Catholic clergy just changed the framework. But this stuff, this is a techne, right? That's what Dr. Skinner calls it. Because that's what it refers to itself that way. It's a skill or a craft like anything else, and there are protocols to any craft. So yeah, that's not something that I really mess around with. I'm not a big fan of the Solomonic tradition, per se, but I definitely, the one really solid thing that I got from there are many solid things I got specifically from my training in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. But the first thing is to be, I would say, overly cautious of this stuff, right? Because at the end of the day, we are always going to be at a severe disadvantage when we're working at things with things on the other side of the veil, because, and a lot of people get this twisted. They don't realize, like, just because it's presenting itself to you as a particular image, that doesn't mean that image is in any way consonant with its inherent nature. This, things lie on that side, and things are able to lie on the astral to a greater degree than we are able to lie and hide ourselves on.
Well, not only
physical.
that, but we lie to ourselves pretty proficiently as well. No one ever thinks it's going to be them that's taken advantage of by the spirits, because they obviously know what's going on. We all, I've been there. We all think that we are immune because we know the stuff. But, we have a really great ability to lie to ourselves as well as being lied to. So it's doubly dangerous.
Agreed.
All right. So, Ike, we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think it's been a very fruitful conversation. Also, shout out to our Elu Cohen out there. We're grateful for your work in context of what we were just talking about. You're needed in the world, and we love you. Please keep doing the good job and fighting the good fight. Luco and boys in the house. Ike, what are you doing right now? Like, what's going on with you? How are you working in the world besides your podcast? What projects are you at work on?
So I'm speaking of Elu Cohen, I'm finishing up the audiobook for Michael Osborne's translation of Martina de Pasquale's treatise on the reintegration of beings. So that, obviously, I've spoken about it before on my own podcast and stuff. Elu Cohen has a really special place in my heart, and it's.
Why is that?
It's
and what is, for those who don't know, for those people listening to our podcast who aren't familiar with that, can you give a little breakdown of that?
Yeah, so it's the Elu Cohen obviously was a I want to say it was a sort of derivative of a Freemasonic sort of interpretation by a man named Martina de Pasquale, who was absolutely brilliant, and obviously he trained Louis Claude de Saint Martin and Jean Baptiste Villermoz in this specific particular system of elect priests of the universe. He had a very amazingly Gnostic sort of cosmogony and cosmology that it was just it when you read the treatise, it's like, where was he getting this stuff from? A lot of this stuff wasn't, academically available or within the reach of, it wasn't in circulation for public reading. So, and I've got a couple of theories on that, but that I won't get into. But he created essentially this order of exorcists that are tasked with certain, ritual operations. But the overarching idea about the Elu Cohen is the reintegration of human beings to an elevated state, whereas we have been denigrated or degraded of our own volition, and we have kind of stepped down from a place of integration and integrity, and now kind of allow ourselves, as we were mentioning earlier, to be influenced and inhabited and really become enmeshed or mired in this sort of the demonic influence that obsessive, potentially possessive element in fallen creation. And so to me, that's some of the best, some of the greatest work that you can undertake. It's extremely noble. It's extremely necessary right now. And it's just in order that for me, all of this stuff really exploded. Everything from my channel, everything that we've talked about, it was all there in latent form. But when I read the treatise on the reintegration of beings for the first time, and, unfortunately it wasn't Michael Osborne's translation because I wasn't out yet. But when I read it for the first time, it was like, there's very few times in I think a person's life when they have such an aha moment and their mind is so physically blown that they just start laughing and there's goosebumps. And it was just this unbelievable moment of like, I see now, I understand. And and I think that happened for a lot of reasons. I think there's some sort of karmic element to it. Obviously, you know, I myself have come to that work. And it's something that I know that the people who do work it, they are some of the best and brightest that I've ever encountered. And actually, those are for anyone wondering, you know, those are the people that I learn from. Those are the guys that are teaching me. So yeah, the Elo Cohen has a tremendous place in my heart, and I'm super, super excited that it just kind of happened. It just worked out so perfectly that Michael heard my podcast with Gregory Shaw actually, and he said, you know, I love the podcast and you've got a great voice for this stuff. Do you want to do the audiobook? And I was just like, amazing. Are you kidding me? Absolutely. I would love to do that. So yeah, so I'm working on that, and I'm doing a lot of Masonic speaking. I'm traveling Monday. I'm flying into Phoenix, Arizona to give a talk at Ascension Lodge, number 89 there. And also I'm working on 2 manuscripts, the first of which is for Tria Prima Press, who have, you know, they've published Jamie Paul Lamb's work and P.D. Newman's work. And it's basically a series of it's 12 essays on the Western esoteric traditions. Everything that I was kind of talking about earlier, this idea of erudition and insight, and kind of this through line, right? That kind of inherited or passed on tradition. That's going to be the focus of that book. And then I'm working on another manuscript for Llewellyn, which has to do with combining the things that I've learned. I went to school for acupuncture and Chinese medicine, and I've worked a lot of Taoist inner alchemy and energetic practices. So I'm kind of taking, it's not my intention to graft, you know, the Western tradition onto those traditions of the East, but there's definitely a consonance there. We're definitely utilizing a lot of that stuff in magic that we're just not explicitly taught, or if so, it's extremely obscure and archaic language. So I'm working on a system of practical magic that is sort of a synthesis of both of those things. That's tentatively calling that etheric magic. And that's, you know, that, and obviously just keeping the channel going. And I love talking to people like yourselves. I love doing, I love having these kinds of conversations that we've had today. I think a lot of that owes to the caliber of hosts that I've had. So again, I've been a big fan for a long time. And it's such a joy for me to come on and talk about this stuff with you gentlemen today.
Oh, we're so glad to have had you on. I mean, it was such a wonderful conversation, and we definitely encourage our listeners to check out your podcast if they haven't heard it, because it's well worth it. It will be rewarding for them, and you're doing really, really worthwhile, genuine, important work, and you can tell your heart is in this, and we appreciate that because we're coming from the same place. Our heart is in this. We're doing this out of a sincere wish to benefit others and share things, and we can see that you're there too, and we want to support you, and we will continue to support you. We love what you're doing. And just again, people, check out Rose Circle Books. Keep your eye on Rose Circle Books, because that's where the audiobook is going to be coming out of this. And as you hear, Ike has a very nice speaking voice, so I'm sure it'll be quite pleasant. And even before it comes out, if you want to check out Rose Circle Books, there's a lot of very interesting books published specifically on this subject and from within this tradition by the illustrious living legend, Piers Vaughn. If you don't know who that is, you might want to look into who that is.
Piers, I love you and I miss you. I'm not sure you're listening, but I'll make my way back soon.
These are pro Piers Vaughn podcasters.
100%.
All right, cool, man. Great to meet you, Ike. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, that was Ike Baker. We really enjoyed having him on the podcast. His podcast is excellent, and we definitely support it. We love high quality work like he's doing. And, he just keeps putting out interesting things too. So keep an eye on him, stay attuned to his work, because he's really doing the work of informing people and getting the message out there, and we really support it.
Yeah, like you said, high quality information, interesting content, and he is consistent with his channel. He's videos come out pretty regularly, so something to definitely keep up with. I agree, and it was a lot of fun. It's nice to meet him.
Wonderful person to talk to. It was so easy to just have that conversation, just so smooth. I definitely look forward to maybe a future meeting with him. It was a great fun.
All right. So this week I'm going to do the book review. And so the one I'm going to do is just one I had laying around, just some light reading. Proclus's commentary on the Parmenides. And
yeah, just some light reading.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, about 600 pages or so, maybe a little bit more. But it's a juggernaut of a commentary. And, all of Proclus's commentaries are excellent. I just happen to have this one handy. And it's by, the translation is by Glenn Morrow and John Dillon. And it's dense, but it follows in the footsteps of, if you're a fan of the De Mysteries by Iamblichus, a lot of Proclus's theology seems to be in that same vein. And so you'll be familiar with a lot of the ideas if you're familiar with that book by Iamblichus. But this book in particular, it's one that can last you a lifetime, really. It goes through the 7 books of the Parmenides, and it's great because at the beginning of each book, there is a introduction / little bit of a commentary by the translators on what Proclus is talking about, what he's getting at, and some of the ideas. And then you have the portions of the Parmenides and then Proclus's commentary on that. So you've got really 2 commentaries going on. And it's helpful because you've got the modern kind of interpretation of Proclus, who can be kind of dense as well. So super interesting. The Parmenides is kind of the culmination of the dialogues, I think, as far as the advancement of Plato's ideas, and it is advanced. It's not light reading, and it's something that you should probably, familiarize yourself with the earlier dialogues before you jump into this. But it is worth it. It covers a lot of the ideas such as the henads and monads. A lot of it has to do with the kind of trying to figure out how there is a unity, but there's also a multiplicity, and it is mathematical. I mean, the Neoplatonists were known for this kind of really mathematical review of theories in order to hyperlogically ascertain the most accurate explanations. And so this is definitely no different. And it's a wild ride if you're able to stick through the whole thing. But it's something I come back to quite frequently, just to kind of reintroduce myself to some of these ideas and refresh. So Proclus's commentary on Plato's Parmenides, translated by Glenn Morrow and John Dillon. This is through Princeton University Press.
I'm a big fan of Proclus's Elements of Theology.
Oh, yeah, totally. That would be another one.
He's, like you said, he's just so systematic, so clear, so thorough in his explication. It's like he doesn't leave a stone unturned in the way that he examines the material. It's pretty incredible, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's very incredible. So highly recommend all Proclus's work if you are interested in Platonism and generally Neoplatonism specifically.
Yeah, for sure. And with that, you can find us in all of the usual places, podcast places, YouTube places, places, where you find places and places. And follow us, support us if you want to keep hearing this, just spread the word. And we're grateful for all of our listeners. and we wish you a wonderful week, month, and year.
See you in the next episode.